Hi, I'm Greg Schaefer. Welcome to the virtual CISO moment. Matthew Webster joins us today. He is the founder and CEO and CISO of Cyvergence. Matthew, or Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
See, I told you I was going to trip over the Matthew or Matt thing, but that's okay.
Go.
It's all good.
All good.
We'd love to hear about your journey and starting with, first of all, why did you get into this wonderful world of information security? Cyber information security, and then your career progression and how it led you to founding a company.
Sure. So I'll be honest. I took a SANS course many years ago. I was doing IT, and I did SANS for a 10-day course on the CISSP, and that was a long time ago. But it just lit my mind on fire. There was so much I didn't know, so much I didn't learn. I went through and got tons of certifications as a result of that. And I just wanted to learn everything. So that, to me, was just what started everything. So I could see all the things we were doing wrong, all the things I wanted to do. And I went from there. So then after going to that, I was lucky enough to jump into doing federal cybersecurity, for those who are familiar with it, either FISMA or NIST 853 at the time. So I went through and did that for 6-7 years, something like that. And that just really opened my eyes to what information could be and what it should be. Because there's a lot of positive things that are coming out of federal cybersecurity. While I have some issues with it, I'm a huge fan of NIST 853.
It's long, it's involved, but it's very comprehensive.
Yes, and it's not for everybody. It is definitely not for everybody. So I'm going to cut a few things short because I basically have been a chief information security officer 3 times. One of those was a global chief information security officer. So I have learned a lot. I have been in the healthcare space. I have been healthcare adjacent. I have been in cyber insurance. I have been in retail. So all of these things make me very well rounded. I had like 5 companies underneath me when I was a global chief information security officer. So there is just a ton of lessons. I have a little bit of sales experience as well. So I used to work at a couple of big companies. And one of the things that I thought was great about it, it was an opportunity for me to absorb and learn. I've looked at probably 1,000 cybersecurity products. I've brought many of them into the programs that I'm working with today. So I'm very well-rounded. I've worked with 10 different frameworks in depth, like cybersecurity frameworks, like there's NIST 853, there's PCI, ISO 27K, versions of SOC 2, TSAX recently. So there really is a lot that I'm used to, and I'm very comfortable jumping into all kinds of different areas in cybersecurity. The only thing I don't do very much these days is the engineering side of the house.
So you mentioned, so I've never asked this question before, but you triggered a question in my mind. You mentioned that you were global CISO for a bit. What is like, if you were to describe like in an elevator speech, what's the difference between the responsibilities of a global CISO versus say a CISO of a mid or large size company here in the US?
So when you start to get up to that level, it should be more at the basically at the level where you're communicating and working with people to say, hey, here's what the risks are. So I used a variation of NIST CSF, added a lot more controls into it, and use it to say, hey, where are you really at? Because I want to get their opinion on things. I want to understand where the companies are at. But it's really about how do you get all of these companies aligned to the corporate cybersecurity program. So you start to build things like a vulnerability management program. Well, you can't just say, well, here's the number of vulnerabilities, because what does that really mean? Right. You've got to say, here are the vulnerabilities per machine on average to get a better sense of things. And this is like when you're dealing with key performance indicators to say, what kind of risk is the company at? And so I was lucky enough to be in the cyber insurance area. So I was really pulling in a lot of that information. I've really honed my cyber risk quantification and some other things dealing with that side of the house. But you really get a sense of what is the real risk to it. And because a lot of us get the cyber risk quantification information that's coming in from the insurance when you're working with it. But I've met a lot of CISOs who don't understand how to use it. I've known CISOs who've taken it, shown it to management, and just walked away and said, hey, I want to go get a pen test done. I can't get anything done. Okay, I'm walking out the door. And there's so much that goes into that, because you can't just show a report and expect change. You've got to get buy-in. You've got to educate people. Because I really think the role of the CISO should be an educator. It should be working with whatever resources are there. It's getting the buy-in, working with the corporate processes that are in place, in some cases forging those corporate processes, and getting buy-in from everybody in order to create that alignment across the board to get things done. So like that NIST CSF assessment that I said that I did, for example, one of the organizations within a very short period of time brought in their own CISO. And it's like, thank you. I work with the internal teams. They're just not getting it. There are tons of challenges. I show one report and they're getting things done very quickly. You know, they completely change what they're doing. So that's what you want. You want them to buy into things with working with whatever resources you have at your disposal.
And that's one thing that in fact, just a blog post that I did, a guest blog post that came out last week from Synomi, that one of the things I mentioned is that not everybody is capable to be a global CISO, for example. It's like I never was above like the mid-range company, if you will. Maybe I think the largest was like 10,000 folks or something like that, but never anything global. On the flip side, though, for what I do today with small and mid-sized businesses, there's such a difference in culture that a lot of times you can't take the mindset of a global CISO and bring it into working for small and mid-sized businesses, partially because you can't just like say, hey, you need to buy this tool. It's like, oh, wait a minute. It's such a different environment. You really have to understand not only how to manage risk overall, but also within the context of where you're at.
Oh, 100%. I agree. You know, I've encountered that myself. I work with even small, medium-sized businesses. I even work with some startups. So I've seen the gamut from very large organizations to very small.
So when we're considering small and mid-sized businesses right now, what would you think is one or a couple of the most significant risks from the information security side to them today?
So I don't like to classify them only on the size of the business. I work with even startups, very small, that are going to be ballooning out very quickly, and the risks are going to change. Also, I like to take a look at the industry. I think lack of knowledge, whether it be on the cybersecurity side of the house, the IT side of the house, I mean, the list goes on. That's really what the challenges are. They don't understand what the big risks are. They don't understand, you know, like I'm a big fan of the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, and full disclosure, I used to work there, but they break things down by industry. And so you can tell what are the general risks, you know, that to your specific corporation. So when you start to look at those things, that's one of the big things. And when you talk about a small business, it's very different than when you talk a medium-sized business, which could be 2,000, 3,000 people, or sometimes more, depending on your definition. You know, sometimes I've walked into organizations and they've got way too many tools, which sounds a little strange, but it's all about, are you utilizing those tools effectively? You know, why would you go to a BAS tool if you're not doing your vulnerability management program? BAS being a breach and attack simulation tool. If you don't really utilize your existing vulnerability tool. And so you've really got to look at things from a different standpoint. You've got to look at the culture. You've got to look at the way things are going. You've got to look at the data. But to me, the other big thing, and this is true whether you're at a small company or a big company, is you have to tell stories. Why are these stories so important? And so you've got to look at things like now we've got the Change Healthcare. We're seeing the impact from that. You know, so many hospitals and healthcare organizations were affected by that. But you've got to understand the importance of third-party risk. I know a CISO who was very not happy that it occurred, but he had said, we need an alternate strategy from doing a business impact analysis. We need an alternate strategy to protect our organization in case something were to happen to this, because this is mission critical. So to me, some of those real basic things, they seem like, oh, it's endless paperwork. Well, doing a BIA, business impact analysis, is really critical to understanding how we can align with the business. I think that's one of the challenges in our industry, is we are not aligned with the business. And so getting them to understand those risks is a critical part of that. And those storytelling, seeing what's going on in the news today, talking about it, making sure all the executives are buying into things and understanding really what the impact is. I think that's a small part of what we can do to improve our craft as CISOs.
I think the storytelling approach is so important, because we talk about business impact analysis, and often that can be a very dry subject, in that you're talking about, well, we could lose this if this happens. It's like, okay, and then there are all these acronyms: RTO, RPO, you know, IPO. You know, it's like that goes down the drain if something bad happens. But all these things tend to be dry. But if you tell a story, and start with like, well, look at what happened to this company here, where they didn't have their response in place. We saw a lot of this recently with the CrowdStrike issue, where it had the unintended, of course, the whole thing was unintended consequence, but the unintended consequence of bringing out where there could be deficiencies as far as responding to incidents and maintaining business continuity. So what if you can't do this? Like some of the airlines had some problems, and even I think Delta might still have a little bit left over right now. Not trying to single them out. I'm just trying to point out that if you had alternate ways to do this and you practice it, then suddenly something like a BIA and a business continuity exercise or tabletop overall doesn't become dry. It becomes a good story and more about company life and death, so to speak.
Oh, I 100% agree. I mean, that is the game changer right there, because you can get into cyber risk quantification and do that, which is a lot of what I love to do. I can tell that story. I know what to do with those cyber insurance reports and tie it into calculating what is the value of the cybersecurity program. Why should we invest in more? Taking a look at those risks. Mm-hmm. But if you don't have a story to go along with it, like, hey, look what happened to company X, company Y, and company Z, and you start adding all those stories up. It's like, oh, that could happen to us, and there's a lot of lessons learned too, like some of those dry things, those requirements that a lot of times people don't want to jump through. Like, for example, when I was doing some of the government, and this was a pretty common thing, before we rolled any new agent out, before we rolled any new version of anything out, we tested it. We sampled it on particular servers, and then we rolled it out, seeing if everything was okay. And if it wasn't, we halted it. And so that testing does take a lot of time to do. A lot of people don't want to get that in place. They don't understand the value of it. But now those companies are sitting back and looking and saying, you know what? This cost us billions of dollars. Yes, it may cost us $1 million to get the right resources to do the appropriate level of testing. But in the end, that is money and time well spent. And so I think that's what we need to do today is look at the ROI of the investment in IT and in cybersecurity by telling these stories. And I think that's part of the story that for me is incredibly important, because you need to change minds, and I use this term in a light way, but in a certain sense, you're talking about changing people's religion, because like, oh, I got to pry open the wallet to pay for cybersecurity. I mean, it's like we don't have any money for it, and here's the reasons why. But you start telling a story like, oh, that is a possible risk. I agree with you. Then you start to change things. And so that's one of the things I do. I think really we don't take a holistic view of what the value is of cybersecurity. There are some approaches that are taken like, well, we take the cyber insurance. Look, it's a $50 million risk. Mm-hmm. That's a 1 in 1,000 year event you're looking at and using that as your inherent risk. Or, is that really realistic? How many leaders are going to look at that and go, yes, we should put $100 million into cybersecurity? Nobody's going to do that. It's this the first thing when you say, look, here's your risk. The CEO is going to say, I don't believe you. Most people are going to say, I don't believe you. And
you have the problem too of like, if you focus so much on one risk, then these other 50, 100, whatever, you're ignoring, and you can't do that.
Oh, 100%. I mean, that's why in this CSF I'm such a big fan of identify, protect, detect, respond, and now govern, because protection is good. Protection is not perfect. Even if you're 90% good in protection, well, if you let 10% of the attacks into your organization, that's not good enough.
No,
because then you've got to make sure that you're able to, identify the problems, look for them. And that's a little bit on the risk management side, but then you've got detect and respond and recover. How do you handle all these other things? Everything is needed together in unison to make sure that you're really protecting organizations today. And to me, that's critical, absolutely critical for organizations.
So let's kind of jump off of that for a moment and talk a little bit more about Cyvergence. First of all, what does Cyvergence do, and why did you found the company? What are you trying to solve?
So I guess there's a whole bunch of different things, because I look at governance is the biggest thing that I like to focus on. But I act as a reseller. I do a lot of education work. I will help out companies in a variety of different ways. But sometimes, like I'm working with some companies, their IT is not very mature. They don't really understand security, and they just need a helping hand to walk them through, And when you sit there and tell stories, story after story after story, it starts to change their mind. Like, oh, now I see why that's important. Oh, and it's like you can see each little moment becomes like an oh moment. Oh. And they start to look at it because they have the stories now behind it and they understand what that value is. And so that's part of what I do. It's like I focus on organizations, whatever they need some help with, cyber risk quantifications, risk assessments, enterprise risk management, virtual CISO, virtual chief risk officer, all kinds of things like that in the governance space. But also, if you need to take a look at architecture, if you're looking at vulnerability management or configuration management or whatever type of program you're looking at building, you need a pen test, great, we can help you with a pen test. There's just a lot of things that I do that are part and parcel with cybersecurity today. Help them pick out a good product. You can be compliant if you go with the freeware antivirus, but are you protected? I mean, you and I both know the answer is no.
Right.
But you talk to a CFO, they might say, well, the answer is yes. But some of this has to do with what are the governance processes that you're using? What do you have in place? Are you saying, are you getting the right ownership in place from a risk perspective? If you've got a CFO who's just saying, no, 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 and you're reporting into the CFO, well, then they become the risk owner because they're the point where you're not having the right levels of discussion within your organization. And there are bigger problems. We can't afford it. We can't afford it. And soon you got nothing going on. Well, okay, what can you afford? And you need to sit down and tell a story to break those barriers. And that's part of what I do through a lot of the basics of cybersecurity is tell those stories and get them to see the value of all these individual programs.
And sometimes when you point out the risk ownership, it's like, okay, well, just because we have this SaaS and our information is up there, it's not my risk anymore. Guess what? Yeah, that's wrong.
That's due diligence. Yeah.
And that's really a huge motivator because you probably have used that 4-letter word risk in this conversation at least a couple of dozen times, which I love it because information security at its core is risk management. You've also talked a little bit about risk quantification, and I have to ask since you mentioned it a couple of times, or what do you recommend that folks use for risk quantification? As a starting point, I'm a fair fan. It's very difficult to do it at scale. That you really, if you're going to do risk quantification, you have to first, I think, do a standard risk assessment. What am I looking for? Not quantity.
Qualitative.
Quality. Well, that works for me. I'm tongue-tied this morning, and I don't know why. But you get to that point, and then you can do the risk quantification. You can actually, with maybe one or two. So from your perspective, best way to do a quantified risk assessment?
Data. So I'm a big fan of key performance indicators. I mean, you take a look at CMMI, and I know there's lots of other variations of that out there. You've got, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. But what's going on in level 2 or level 3 or level 4? Do you have cybersecurity signing off? Where does cybersecurity report from a governance standpoint? Are there challenges to take a look at? Are you collecting key performance indicators? What's the efficacy of that key performance indicator? So let's take vulnerability management. If you're not doing a discovery scan or let's say you're ignoring IoT devices in your organization, that's a big issue. Well, I mean, it depends on the organization. If you know IoT, it's not an issue. But if you've got a lot of IoT, and a lot of organizations do, especially like in the manufacturing sector, and you're not doing any type of vulnerability management, you could be leaving these things wide open. I've walked into organizations that have had default passwords set on IoT devices. I mean, this is
joy.
one level cybersecurity stuff here. This is not being a rocket science.
Default telnet passwords.
Exactly.
Going back to they were probably installed in 1994. So.
Oh yeah. So that's part of what it is. If you understand what makes up a key performance indicator and you understand the context behind it and you understand the risk, that really starts to bring in some of those numbers. And the aggregate is much easier than the details. So sometimes you have to take a look at what are the generics, but then you can get down to the granular level and you can say, hey, here's the generic number that you're working with. But sometimes what you can do, and I've got other methods for that, you could take a look at a whole system. This system has, 50,000 records. Okay, well, that's about $3 million of risk. Here's the controls you should put in place. But if you take a look at the total number of records, and I actually will admit, the records is what we all learn about when we read the Pony-Mon report. I know IBM just came out with their new report, or Verizon, or some of these others. That's a good way to do things. It's actually what I'm going to refer to as a poor person's way of doing risk quantification. That's why I like working with data scientists who pull in that information to get something realistic. Now, I went and listened to one of the directors within the US government was talking about, do we understand what the maximum risk is from a cyber perspective? Right now, we don't. We're working on public-private partnerships to determine how do we come up with a number that makes sense, because we still have challenges. It's actually worse than our best data science is actually aware of. And we know that just because we've taken a look at the data, we've taken a look at the incidents that happened. The cyber insurance industry is taking a bit of a hit over the last several years. And I don't think there's a lot of data that's there, but a lot of it's utilized, because how do you look at the architecture of one versus the architecture of another? Well, what if you've got strong architecture? Let's say you've got strong VLANs and your IoTs on a different VLAN, but you don't have VLAN ACLs. Well, then the question is, well, how often do you review those ACLs? How open are they? Because you get people who are like, oh, I'm so frustrated. Let me just do what's called a permit IP any. Basically, it's just open up that entire port to whatever. Well,
then the VLAN becomes almost useless, because you've basically, with the exception of like segmenting your broadcast domain, which is the terminology from back in the day, you're not doing anything. And that's why, like, for example, with PCI, it's like, they say segment your network, and people will say, well, I've got an ACL, or I've got a VLAN here. Okay, where's your ACLs? No, we don't use ACLs. Well, then you're not doing anything.
Exactly.
I mean, fundamentally, it does not meet, just because the wording in PCI says segment and you have different subnet masks. It's like it's not doing anything.
Yeah. So, and PCI is an interesting one, too, because you look at it, on some level, it seems much tougher than, say, a SOC 2 or some of the others. When I eventually got around to doing a PCI assessment, somebody else doing it, I should say, they are so easy. The auditors were great. Like, let me just hand this over to you on a silver platter. I'm like, wow. I mean, might as well go to a SOC 2 type 1, which is barely it is an assessment, it is legitimate, but you find some example where you're doing something right. And it's like, if you're doing that, you're not really doing a real test of an organization to figure out how strong those controls are, and so that's some of the challenges that I see within some of the compliance framework. Compliance is good, but it's a form of governance, and it's an external form of governance, but they work within the framework that they're used to working in. The only time I've seen that separated is, say, doing government work, because they just make, I think this is a risk. Like, it's not a risk. Nobody else has these issues. I understand, because you're an auditor coming in from the outside, you find an issue, but I personally don't. Nobody in these whole three organizations find this to be an issue.
Right.
So those are some of the challenges. I've always, in government, it's like you look at the auditor as the enemy. In the rest of the world, they're your friends trying to get the right thing done for the organization. So,
right.
It's you have to take a look at it. I do think, like, high trust I've worked with, that's a little bit too far, but I understand it, and there's a lot of value in it. And it's also changed and shifted over the years too, from the general rubric that it uses to score high trust. So that's a whole nother ball game to get into, is what's appropriate. And to me, one of the things that I like to tell CEOs, well, do you know if you're able to pay your people? Do you have like a generic financial KPI that you work with? And the answer is yes. Everybody's got some sort of way of validating what's going on. Like, don't you want the same thing for cybersecurity?
Right. And while we were talking, and since we were talking about business continuity, for some reason during this, my camera just blanked out on me. As you can, I don't think you can see me, right? I'm like totally black right now, or can you see me?
I see a still picture of you.
You see us still? Well, that's rather odd. Well, we'll continue on with this, since I've never had this happen. My camera light is still on. But I just see black on my side, so maybe it'll come back. But I don't think people want to look at me anyway. But there's a lot of stress when it comes to information security and cybersecurity, and also being an entrepreneur, and also running a podcast when you lose your camera all of a sudden. What's one of the things that you do to help manage that stress, to decompress? Because we all got to get away from it. We can't be at a high stress level all the time.
Sure. Well, some of you may be shocked, but I read, so I got a lot of things. But I'm a bit of an explorer. I like trying new foods. Like, I'm in New York City. I love the fact we've got so many different types of food available. To me, that's fun. Go to some new type of restaurant, try a cuisine you've never had before. but I'm also an outdoorsy guy. I try to get out as much as possible. Like I like to go on my morning walks just all over in Brooklyn, and being out in nature is actually very helpful. I think there's even been studies to that effect to really help. But just spending time with friends and family, I think that's very important. There's only so many days we have on this earth, and we try to make the most of them. I mean, that's to me is what's most important. I mean, yeah, I'll go see movies and do some other things, but I definitely make sure that I try to decompress. I like listening to music, going to concerts. All of those types of things to me are therapeutic in their own way, because they take you out of the world of trying to think about cybersecurity and entrepreneurship and all these other things, and give you some element of rest, in my opinion.
Now, just quickly, before we started the recording, you had mentioned a couple of statistics. Would you mind repeating those here, as far as like just to illustrate the stress within our industry?
Sure. So Gartner, late 2022, had a report that said 50% of CISOs were looking at leaving their positions. 25% of those were looking at leaving the industry altogether. Now, Ian's came up with another report saying that up to 75% of CISOs were looking at leaving their position. I mean, that's incredibly high. I think, you could say, well, it's a different data set between Gartner and Ian's. And I think that's some of the influence, but some of it, I think, is a lot more than that. We had a lot of new regulations that were coming out. You have Tim Brown, the Security Exchange Commission,
right?
Him out specifically.
Right.
That's a challenge. And so I think you've got a lot of those types of things that are going on. Like, is this something I really want to get involved in? Because every CISO, anybody who's been in that role, knows there is garbage to deal with. And we all have to deal with it. But then you start enhancing the regulations. And really, what should a CISO be doing? We're the risk managers. We're here to tell stories. We're here to get things across, letting people understand why these things need to get done. But if there are strong roadblocks for whatever reason, that's what we have to deal with. And so if you're dealing with very, very strong roadblocks, especially if regulation is on there, you take a look at, say, NYDFS, New York Department of Financial Services, now you need the CEO signing off with the CISO. That is a positive control, in my view, because if you have the CEO signing off, all of a sudden that relationship between the CISO and the CEO is going to be much stronger. And I think that creates a healthier relationship overall, because you can't have business separated from cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is there to support the business, just like IT is there to support the business.
And then they actually understand the risk more, because they need to pay a little bit more attention, which gets back to what we were talking about before. And obviously, my vast staff here of support have gotten my camera back, which I'm wonderfully thankful for. Final question: what are your future plans? What's coming down the road for you?
So I love what I'm doing now. I mean, it's a lot of fun. There's just so much that's going on. I just want to keep expanding. I mean, obviously, I'm doing things like BIAs, DRPs, continuity of operations, things like that. But it's looking at cyber resilience, but also looking at it from a more business mindset. I think that's where today's CISOs need to be. We need some more of those people skills. But I love this journey that I've started. It's fairly recent, just barely more than a year ago. I started this venture. I'm looking to see where it's going to go. I mean, that's where I'm at right now.
That's awesome, Matt. Well, listen, despite the little technology glitches, it went well. I'm glad that you didn't blank out, because people needed to see you, not me. But really appreciate you taking your time to join me today. I love the conversation. Always love talking about risk. So thank you so much for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And everybody, stay secure.